Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was written by one of our newest voices on the channel, Jesse Vasquez. We'll be taking a sobering look into the history of the Appalachian Mountains, specifically the deadliest battle fought on American soil since the Civil War, and how it inspired the fictional world of the Hunger Games. Be sure to drop a like on this video, check the links in the description and pinned comment, tell me what you think of the Hunger Games movies and books, and let's dive all the way into this, shall we? In the fictional world of Panem, a girl from a gentrified coal mining mountain town learned to survive through grit, self-sufficience, and more than a little rebelliousness. The girl on fire lit the spark that burned away the foundation of her dystopian civilization and inspired a generation in our world to challenge the structure of their own society. While Katniss Everdeen and her Mockingjay pin are now immortalized in pop culture and have even unironically become a symbol of resistance, few people know the real-life inspiration. The descriptions of the geographic locations of the districts are vague, with District 12 being one of the few exceptions. In the first novel, it's stated early on Katniss's home is in a place that was once known as Appalachia, where they mined coal even hundreds of years in the past. The Appalachian Mountains stretch over 2,000 miles across eastern North America, from Alabama through 18 states, up into Canada. Coal has historically been mined in central Appalachia, in parts of Alabama, eastern Kentucky, Maryland, Ohio, Virginia, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. The terrain is isolated and harsh, and the people who've lived there have earned a reputation for being self-reliant and often distrustful of authority. The primary native tribes that are affiliated with this area are the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, and Muskogee people. English, French, and German immigrants settled in the region in the early 1700s, but the largest group to make up the Appalachian population were the Scots-Irish, also known as Scotch-Irish. These were originally Scottish borderlanders who rebelled against England, and as an attempt to subdue them, were given land in Northern Ireland by King James. This was both a ploy to get them out of the way in Scotland and an attempt to make them a thorn in the sides of the equally rebellious Irish. For about 100 years, they meddled with and clashed against Irish culture and harsh living conditions. Between 1717 and 1775, hundreds of thousands of Scotch-Irish migrated to the New World and found themselves well suited for the rough landscape of Appalachia. The Scotch-Irish brought a unique culture that became distinctly Appalachian, possibly the most recognizable of which being their unmistakable musical influence. They took with them to the New World traditional Scottish ballads and the fiddle, as it was easy to carry and great for accompanying dances. In the mountains, these elements blended with musical styles from people of African origin. Such singing methods, dances, and the banjo, an instrument iconic to the region, but whose roots come from Africa. Vocal feathering, believed to be influenced by Germanic yodeling and indigenous singing, found its way into the mix, all of which would culminate into the music style that would later be known as bluegrass. The name bluegrass emerged in the 1930s through the music of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, so named after the grass that was emblematic of Monroe's Kentucky home. One of the best-known Appalachian country singers to this day is June Carter Cash, who was introduced to Appalachian folk songs as a child and began performing at age 10. She developed a unique stage presence, which the Hunger Games pays homage to through District 12's first victor, Lucy Gray Briard, the charismatic folk singer protagonist in the prequel The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. Many offensive stereotypes emerged with this music style, such as deeply racist minstrel shows and the character of the uncouth hoedowning hillbilly, harmful prejudices that people of the region face to this day. While music was frequently used for idle entertainment, it was also an important way Appalachian people preserved their culture and resisted assimilation. As in the fictional District 12, it was also used by the working class to speak out against their abuse and mistreatment, like the music of coal miner and labor activist Nimrod Workman. Yes, that is a real name. Nimrod began working in the mines of West Virginia in 1909 when he was just 14, and continued for 42 years until black lung and a slipped disc forced him to stop. He dedicated his life to fighting for the labor rights of miners, in no small part through the songs he sang depicting hardships that miners faced. He marched with the notorious labor activist Mother Jones in the 1920s, and lobbied Congress for black lung compensation in the 1960s. Workmen paved the way for singers like Merle Travis, the son of a coal miner who grew up in a company-owned house. Travis went on to write songs like 16 Tons, a haunting ballad about the hardships miners faced based on a frequent quote of his father's: "I can't afford to die. I owe my soul to the company's store." Coal mining in Appalachia began in the mid-1700s, but saw a massive boom following the Civil War. As the need for miners grew, coal towns were established in and around central Appalachia. Most of the towns were owned by faraway companies that reaped the benefits of coal production while putting very little wealth back into Appalachian communities. Workers lived in company-owned shacks, the rent of which was docked from their wages, and were usually paid in scrip, a form of currency that was worth less than official US currency, and could only be used in company-owned stores where the cost of basic necessities were inflated to take advantage of the town's isolation and lack of competition. Any wage increases the miners received resulted in hiked rent and even more inflated supply prices, much the way mega corporations price gouge at every opportunity today. Yay! Go deregulation. Employers of the mines boasted equal pay for the same work, but the towns were usually segregated. Unsurprisingly, the sections that housed newly freed African Americans and other discriminated against minorities were in much worse repair than the already less than ideal company housing. Coal operators believed this would stop workers from collaborating together and unionizing. Suzanne Collins pulled heavily from these histories for her novels, where the impoverished part of District 12 housed mostly people of color, who weathered constant manipulation and mistreatment on a grander scale than those in the district who had fairer complexions and whose living arrangements were slightly less dire. This pitted workers against each other and kept them from uniting together to challenge the capital's authority. And make no mistake, this was the exact tactic coal companies used in Appalachia and is still a tactic deployed against the working class to this day. Gotta love some good old-fashioned propaganda against the working class of America, right? Mining coal is arduous, dangerous work. In its early days, injuries and chronic health conditions such as lung damage were common, and death was a constant threat. In May of 1902, a mine explosion in Freighterville, Tennessee claimed the lives of more than 215 men, leaving all but 3 of the town's men dead. Some of the trapped miners left letters with haunting goodbyes for their loved ones, either written on scraps of paper they had with them or on the walls of the tunnel they were trapped in. 1907 proved to be a particularly deadly year for coal miners, with at least 32,000 men and children killed on the job, including the mine explosion in Monongah, West Virginia that claimed more than 360 lives. Some of the casualties were as young as 8 years old. Despite this, mining companies did little to nothing in the way of improving worker safety. Mining towns had no elected officials and no independent police forces. Frequently, they were fenced in with the claim that it was for the residents' protection. Politicians were slow to intervene and oppose coal mining companies due to a combination of good old-fashioned government corruption, yay, and the number of mines that needed inspecting simply outnumbering how many inspectors there were. These circumstances left coal companies pretty much governing themselves. And hey, that's a great idea, right? What could possibly go wrong? Company owners bribed officials to turn a blind eye to the less than ethical antics of their hired muscle, the private detectives from Baldwin Felts Detective Agency. These so-called detectives had a reputation of effective ruthlessness, and behaved something like the Toon Patrol weasels from Who Framed Roger Rabbit. They were at best security guards, and at worst merciless thugs who were relentless at weeding out anything that resembled unionizing. They gained heightened notoriety after their involvement in the Ludlow Massacre, where 2 miners' wives and 12 children were killed in a fire after a strike. As industrialization grew in the states, Baldwin Felt agents were frequently hired by owners of large businesses whenever they were under scrutiny for, say, a workplace incident. And they were excellent at finding a fall guy to take the blame for any negligent or illegal wrongdoings within companies. In 1912, unionized Paint Creek miners in West Virginia attempted to negotiate a modest pay raise that was comparable to coal miners in the surrounding areas. When operators refused, workers launched a wildcat strike on April 18th, which was basically a strike without union assistance. In the nearby Cabin Creek mine, 7,500 non-union miners joined in the strike. In retaliation, coal operators sent in Baldwin Felts detectives, who then began what would later be described by Republican Attorney General of West Virginia Howard B. Lee as a campaign of assault, intimidation, and terrorism without parallel in the history of American industrial struggle. Strikers were evicted from their homes and driven from company property. Baldwin Felts agents erected iron and concrete structures armed with machine guns in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek area and employed the Bull Moose Special, which was a train car reinforced with iron plating and was equipped with machine guns inside, because, as they say, there's no kill like overkill. On the night of February 7, 1913, coal operator Quinn Morton, Kanawha County Sheriff Bonner Hill, and several agents and deputies turned off the lights on one such train and drove through a tent encampment, where they fired on sleeping miners and their families. While there were several injuries, the death of Italian immigrant Francisco Estrip, who was shot in the face while attempting to protect his pregnant wife and their family, caused particular outrage and sparked public support for the striking miners. United Mine Workers, or UMW, sent their full support despite not initially sanctioning the strike, and soon sent UMW Vice President Frank Hayes along with labor activist Mary Mother Jones. Mother Jones's colorful reputation preceded her. In 1861, she married George Jones, a foundry worker and organizer for the National Union of Iron Molders in 1861. Tragedy struck when yellow fever claimed the lives of her husband and their 4 children in 1867, and then again when her dressmaking shop burned down a few years later. With nothing left to lose, she dedicated the rest of her life to fighting for the rights of working people. She and her followers created a persona where she played the role of mother to all downtrodden people everywhere. She dressed in antique black dresses and exaggerated her age. By 1900, no one called her Mary and referred to her solely as Mother. Futurama did something similar with the character of Mom, the evil chief executive officer of Mom Corp, which is ironically exactly the sort of entity Mother Jones would have rallied against. Hiding behind this facade of an elderly matriarch, Mother Jones was free to travel where she liked and speak out, often outlandishly, in a way that few women were allowed to at the time. She began rallying coal miners in the 1890s with bold and sometimes obscene calls to action. She was a self-proclaimed hellraiser and was declared by one U.S. attorney as the most dangerous woman in America. One of her most famous battle cries was, "Pray for the dead and fight like hell for the living." She arrived in the Paint Creek Cabin Creek area in July of 1912. When she was 84 years old, and rallied 3,000 armed coal miners to march on the state capitol to read a declaration of war to Governor William E. Glasscock. On July 26th, miners attacked the town of Mucklow, where Baldwin Felts agents were stationed, resulting in the death of 4 guards and at least 12 strikers. On September 2nd, Governor Glasscock declared martial law and sent 1,200 state militia members to the area. The miners initially believed the soldiers were there to protect their rights and welcomed them, but it was soon evident that their purpose was to break up the strike. 200 strikers and strike leaders were arrested without warrants, including Mother Jones. They were imprisoned and tried before military tribunals for inciting violence, while unsurprisingly, guards and coal operators faced no consequences for their part in the bloodshed. It was an unprecedented execution of martial law and was widely condemned across the country. For a while, things went back to the status quo, with mine operators regaining a death grip on the southern Appalachian coal region by keeping miners downtrodden through isolation and grim living conditions, as well as with a constant presence of Baldwin Felts agents. Then, as the U.S. entered the First World War, labor relations underwent a major paradigm shift in the country. Since there was no longer a surplus of labor for the booming economy, worker influence grew, and unions gained members in staggering numbers. This led to more government involvement in labor relations to ensure wartime production. President Woodrow Wilson was initially perceived as a champion of labor rights, and there was a sense of real hope about the future. Regulations and restrictions were placed on private banks and megacorporations like Ford Motor Company and U.S. Steel, and a new Department of Labor was established as part of the cabinet. The first secretary appointed to the department was William B. Wilson, a former coal miner and a miner union leader. The Wilson administration successfully instituted 8-hour workdays for railroad workers and banned child labor. But when Republicans regained power in the White House in the 1920s, things began to backslide. With the end of the war, many wartime policies ended and the government once again withdrew from labor relations. As was already historically the case, one of the regions hit hardest were the coal mines of West Virginia, which were nicknamed the El Dorado of Appalachia due to its abundance of coal. It was a difficult place for unions to reach due to its physical isolation and the inherent independence of its inhabitants, which made it particularly susceptible to the corruption of coal operators. In 1920, miners in Matewan, West Virginia managed to unionize despite the roadblocks coal operators put in place, such as Baldwin felt spies and company-encouraged racism. After an empty gesture pay raise that was completely negated by a hike in rent and supply prices, the miners went on strike. Predictably, operators responded by evicting workers and their families from their company-owned homes. Displaced miners formed tent camps where they survived by hunting small game and scavenging for food, which is likely where Suzanne Collins drew inspiration for Katniss's father. Despite frequent violent raids from Baldwin felt agents, the miners held their ground. Company owners then deployed their tried-and-true method of bribing local officials, sending Albert Felts, brother of one of the founding members of Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, to directly deliver a bribe to Mayor Cable Testerman of Matewan. Felts intended to station machine guns on various rooftops throughout the town to gun down anticipated marching strikers, but Mayor Testerman was a staunch supporter of the miners and refused, along with his police chief, Sid Hatfield. Hatfield was a former miner himself, and took it as his personal mission to circumvent Baldwin Felts agents. He often assisted miners who were evicted and helped slow down raids on the miners' tent colonies by demanding to see warrants from the agents, which of course they didn't have since they had no legal grounds for what they were doing. On May 19, 1920, a verbal altercation broke out between Hatfield and Felts in Matewan. They claimed they had the right to arrest the other, and the argument boiled over into a shootout. It's still widely contested who shot first, but when the dust settled, 10 men were dead, including Mayor Testerman and brothers Albert and Lee Felts. Sid Hatfield survived the massacre and became something of a symbol for the miners' struggle. He was acquitted of murder charges, but 14 months later, T.L. Felts, the Baldwin Felts co-founder who lost his two brothers in the massacre, brought a conspiracy charge against him and Deputy Ed Chambers. On August 1, 1921, Hatfield and Chambers arrived at the courthouse unarmed, as they were promised safe travel. Then, on the steps of the McDowell County Courthouse, with their wives on their arms, they were gunned down by Baldwin Felts agents. The murders inspired a guerrilla war in Mingo County, and officials declared martial law, resulting in the arrest of hundreds of miners. 2,000 people attended Hatfield's funeral, and after failed negotiations with West Virginia Governor Ephraim Franklin Morgan, 10,000 armed miners began a march to Mingo County to free their fellow miners who were imprisoned. They marched with red paisley bandanas around their necks, some carrying American flags because there's nothing more American than fighting for your rights against a greedy and corrupt government. Unfortunately, many journalists at the time painted a much different picture. Playing up the stereotype of the inherently violent people from the Appalachian region, newspapers helped turn public opinion against their cause and led many people to believe the miners deserved the abuse they were dealt. As a result, the marching army of miners encountered resistance made up of police, Baldwin Felts agents, and citizen volunteers. The so-called Redneck Army clashed with these anti-union forces at Blair Mountain, struggling against machine guns and even 3 private planes that dropped gas and homemade bombs on the miners. On August 30th, 1921, after several pleas for help from Governor Morgan, U.S. President Warren G. Harding issued an ultimatum to the rebel miners: leave within 48 hours or face the U.S. Army. The miners refused and pushed forward, gaining some ground, but on September 3rd, the U.S. Army took control of the area. Many of the miners were veterans and considered themselves patriots, and thus did not want to fire on the U.S. Army, so a ceasefire was agreed upon. An estimated 20 to 100 people were killed in the conflict, and 985 miners were indicted for murder and treason. and as a result, Union membership dropped from 50,000 to 10,000. Violent battles between coal miners and coal operators continued through the 1930s, particularly in the Appalachian community of Harlan County, Kentucky. The region earned the nickname Bloody Harlan after a wildcat strike in 1931 turned deadly. A soup kitchen set up in Everett by the National Miners Union for the now homeless strikers was dynamited, and miners guarding other soup kitchens in the county were arrested with little to no justification. Others were beaten and driven out of Harlan County. On August 30th, 2 miners were shot and killed at a soup kitchen in Clovertown, a rural neighborhood in Harlan. In February of 1932, police shot and killed 19-year-old Harry Sims, who was a union organizer. The murder was the inspiration for the folk song The Death of Harry Sims, written by his fellow coal miner Jim Garland and sung by Garland's sister. When journalists attempted to investigate the conditions in Harlan firsthand, they were arrested, intimidated, and forced from the county. Skirmishes continued in the region until February of 1937, when deputies fired on the home of Marshall Music, a minister and union organizer. Music's 15-year-old son was killed in the shooting, bringing Harlan under national scrutiny. A month-long investigation ended in federal criminal indictments of Sheriff Theodore R. Middleton, 22 of his deputies, 22 companies, and 24 coal operators. Though none of them faced any charges, operators now feared federal support of organized labor, and many of them signed labor agreements. In 1938, Kentucky became the last state to outlaw the private mine guard system, ending Baldwin Felt's reign of terror. By the end of the decade, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs reached the remote parts of Appalachia, improving workers' lives with emergency relief, union protections, and banking law reforms. Over the years, state and federal governments have subsidized coal companies to keep the industry going, with the cost predictably being taken from Central Appalachia's economy rather than from the corporations profiting from coal. The 80s and 90s saw an erosion of labor rights that left coal miners once again vulnerable to exploitation, and present-day residents find themselves in the same poverty trap that's gripped the region for over a century, with very little wealth being put back into their economy. Thanks, Reagan. Schools are underfunded, making it difficult for young people in the area to acquire a higher education, and poverty and unemployment rates are significantly higher than the rest of the nation's. The distribution of healthcare providers to the region is lower compared to that of most of the country, despite hospitalization for heart disease being 17% higher than the national rating, and lung cancer being nearly 25% higher in Appalachian men than the men living in the rest of the US. Still, generations of families find themselves working in the mines due to the lack of economic complexity in the region. And politicians continue to compound the problem by giving corporations more opportunities to make a profit off this finite resource rather than investing in the people they use to harvest it. Though the Appalachian coal miner struggles are not widely known today, the Miners' Rebellion was the largest labor uprising in U.S. history and the largest armed uprising since the Civil War. They fought for the same things the working class fights for today, and they demonstrated that the only way to make progress is through intersectionality. And, to quote Hamish Abernathy in Catching Fire, to remember who the enemy is. I hope you learned something new today. Sometimes history can be a scary thing to research because it shows us the evil humanity is all too willing to inflict on itself, its own people, its own species. It's why we gravitate to stories like The Hunger Games, because we enjoy seeing the good guys overcome what seems like an impossible task. Be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and be sure to keep it tuned here to Geographics for more videos like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.